Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Steering Through Transitions, Ensuring Team Adaptability and Service Continuity. Next slide, please. You can keep going. I want to take a moment to thank the office. The Office for Victims of Crime, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice for sponsoring this webinar today, and remind you that the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations that you may hear throughout this presentation are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent the official position or the policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. I also want to mention that any of the pictures you see on these slides are all models and are not survivors. Next slide.
That we know of.
That we know of, yes. They're all models. And just a reminder, if you could mute when you're not speaking so we can cut down on background noise. We're going to be using the chat feature quite a bit this time, and we'll be keeping an eye on it. Please make sure to rename your Zoom square if it doesn't have your name on it. And you can raise your hand, but we're encouraging use of the chat because we're really going to be watching it quite closely. There are not breakout rooms this time, but if you have any technical issues, if you could you can put in the chat for me, Marty Washington, or you can email me at mwashington@ncall.us. And I'm going to turn it over to the presenters.
Thanks, Marty. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leigh Goulbourne. I'm the Technical Assistance Program Coordinator at the New York City Elder Abuse Center at Weill Cornell Medicine, and this is my colleague.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Rutledge. I'm also a technical assistance provider statewide for the New York State. I cover teams in upstate New York, and also just want to say that I have been an EMDT coordinator prior to my current position.
Thanks, Jill. So actually, if we could go back one. Thank you. So in our role, we offer guidance and support to our dedicated coordinators who build and maintain multidisciplinary team for elder survivors of abuse and mistreatment. I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of the coordinators who are joining us today are from the national grant. There are subtle differences between the New York State and national TA approaches, but there's one core principle that remains consistent across the board, and that's that every team is unique. We truly appreciate and celebrate those differences, and we never prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach. Our aim here is really to collaborate, learn from each other, and tailor our support to meet the specific needs of each team. Next slide, please. So let's delve into a bit of what you can expect to take away from today's webinar. Our primary aim is to equip each one of you with actionable insights and strategies that will help you to navigate the various shifts and changes within your teams more effectively. First, we're going to start by unraveling the intricacies of team dynamics. Recognizing how teams function and evolve is fundamental, especially when key members transition. But we're going to spend the bulk of our time today addressing how to manage transitions. Whether planned or unexpected, transitions can be a challenging phase. We're going to share strategies to handle them seamlessly. The overarching theme for today is adapting to change. In a constantly evolving environment, being adaptable is incredibly important. We're going to aim to provide you with tools that will foster resilience and a proactive approach in the face of change. So with these objectives in mind, let's begin our journey together. Next slide, please.
So we'd love to first gauge who we have in the room with us today. So if you are an EMDT coordinator, maybe if you could please put in the chat how long you've been facilitating your team. And if you're from another discipline, we don't suspect there are many of you, but if you are from another discipline, can stick that in the chat as well. We'll give you a minute to do that.
And we're a smaller group today, so we really encourage you to to use this time to interact with us and pick our brains. We're open to not feedback, to your questions, and would love to know how your work is shaped by what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm seeing in the chat we have Kirk has been 2 years as a coordinator and prosecutor, and Bernadette has been, I assume, a coordinator for 3 years. Thank you.
Thanks. And less than 3 months, and also a civil attorney. Wow. So, well, welcome to the EMDT. And I think go ahead and keep putting those in if you want, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. So we are suspecting that many of you, if not all of you, have at some point been introduced to stages of group development that were first described by Bruce Tuckman, who's a psychologist way back in 1965. And over many years, other researchers have corroborated his findings, which really show that all successful groups follow a similar pattern of evolution. So we just wanted to briefly review this concept for you because we think it's relevant when thinking about how changes can affect a group. So again, this may be a reminder, but the 4 main stages include forming, storming, norming, and performing. And there's sometimes a fifth stage that's added, which has different names, sometimes reviving, adapting, or adjourning, depending on what you read. But the similar points, every group goes through these similar stages, and every stage builds on the one that comes before it. The first 3 are pretty much the like laying the groundwork and establishing the group, and then you eventually would hopefully get to that performing stage, which is where the group would be functioning successfully as a unit and accomplishing the tasks productively. So every group has to go through these stages. You can't skip a stage. So it really can be a process. But the stages are not so much linear, but rather can be thought of as on a continuous cycle like this slide shows. The point is that with any change, a group may need to circle back to the beginning stages or stages that you may have already processed through at one point and repeat them again in order to return back to your previous level of function. Uh-oh.
Thanks. As we dive deeper into our discussions on team dynamics and transitions, it's really crucial to understand the broader context in which we're all operating. The slide here illustrates some really pivotal moments that we've been experiencing in recent times. The globe has faced unprecedented changes, a phrase we've heard over and over the past few years, with COVID-19 redefining how we live, work, and interact. Social upheaval and the call for equality and justice have led to a reevaluation of priorities at various levels: societal, organizational, and individual. Moreover, many professionals are grappling with heightened levels of stress, feelings of burnout, instances of vicarious trauma. This has given rise to, some other phenomena like the Great Resignation, where individuals might reevaluate their professional commitments and seek more fulfilling avenues. And there are also really tangible repercussions for our programs. Funding avenues might dwindle or shift, organizational objectives could be realigned, and personal priorities might undergo unique transformations. So it's really imperative to acknowledge the ripple effects of some of the broader context here. But this slide really underscores a fundamental truth that transitions aren't isolated to our teams or our departments. They're happening on a global scale, influencing each one of us in unique ways. And so as we're continuing to talk about what those transitions could look like at your team's level, let's bear in mind the broader backdrop, and because it will really help contextualize our discussions and the strategies that we're giving today. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so with that, let's delve into transitions. So our question to you is this: what types of team losses or transitions have your teams experienced? I know we have a pretty broad scale of experience in the room in terms of how long you have been coordinating your teams. But yeah, have your teams experienced losses or transitions, and what kinds of transitions have you experienced? We're going to give you a couple minutes to think about that and put your answers in the chat before we move on. Next slide, please. So I'm seeing in the chat, transitioning from in-person to virtual meetings due to COVID. That's a huge one. I see no losses, but we're continuing to add members. That's definitely a transition state, and we're going to talk a bit today about what like the onboarding process can look like, particularly when you're in the middle of like a transition. But I think that information will still be really useful for you. Okay. So the way that we're thinking about transitions can be broadly grouped into two primary categories: temporary transitions and permanent transitions. So in the temporary loss group, there are team members who are expected to ultimately return. So planned leaves of absences could be for reasons such as, maternity leave, a well-deserved vacation, perhaps due to a temporarily heightened workload. There are unplanned leaves of absences, which can often be more challenging to plan around. This can arise from unforeseen circumstances like a sudden illness, a tragic accident. It's crucial to be prepared for unplanned events, but these are really difficult to anticipate. And then on the other hand, we have permanent losses, which mark a conclusive transition with no anticipated return. This could be the result of a team member finding a new job, retiring, or even due to changes in their role within the same agency, such as a promotion. Unfortunately, there are also situations like terminations or the disheartening loss of program funding that can lead to unavoidable transition. And just as a side note, as the coordinator, you might not be privy to the reason for the change. So you'll likely need to consider the sensitivity and the confidentiality that each situation requires as you're making plans for how to deal with the impact of those transitions. Next slide.
So we're definitely making you all work today. We have a third question for you that we'd like to pose, and that is, what are some potential impacts of team member transitions? So it doesn't sound like you all have experienced too many transitions, but can you think of what might be some ways that other team members might be affected by a transition, or how might a transition or a change or a loss affect how the team functions? And again, we'll give you a couple minutes to brainstorm, or a minute.
I feel like we should have the Jeopardy music in the back.
It's always hard because you have to think about them and then you have to type them in. And when you're joining a webinar, you're never necessarily expecting that we're going to put you to work. But I believe that this is our last question that we're asking in this way. So, but as you're thinking about them, I'll throw out, we got one: lack of confidence or trust. That's definitely true. Staff or team member turnover. Feeling like you have to bring the new person up to speed, but the current members have to sit through the conversation over and over if there are lots of changes. Oh, absolutely. So you're really managing, all of those different things because you have lots of different team members. So yeah, it impacts the action steps potentially. So it may slow down the movement in the case. So if things are up and running and then all of a sudden there's a transition, that can be really disheartening for folks. If there's suddenly an inability to get things done, as you guys mentioned, the impact on the general vibe of the team, harming the morale of the team. Just, there may be a feeling of loss that people would experience. And then you also mentioned, the possibility of the domino effect. So, you may find that team members start to lose interest, and you may find that some of your team members may actually fall off participating because of a transition. So as we're talking about managing transitions in the EMDT, we wanted to give you kind of an analogy to think about. So I'd like you to picture a tall ship, and a tall ship is a traditional sailing vessel with at least 2 masts. So perhaps it would be a ship in the British Navy, say in the 19th century. And if you could picture the tall wooden masts and the elaborate sails and all the ropes and the rigging, and maybe it has one of those crow's nest things where the person yells "ships ahoy" or whatever they say, and it might have multiple decks. There would likely be a large crew of sailors on board, and there might even be some passengers. And the voyage that's planned could be planned for many months potentially. And all of those people on board would be living and working in very close quarters. So it would almost be like a mini city on the ocean. So you can imagine that it would be really essential for the survival of basically everybody on board the ship to function as a very strong team unit. So in order to set sail, what might be some things that would be needed to get the vessel into, we've all heard of ship shape. So you'd want to make sure that everybody on board knows their defined role. So from the captain to the officers and the mates and all the way down to the lowly cabin boy, you would want everyone to have, contribute their specific expertise or have their specific role. You would probably want to have set procedures for every detail. So for steering the ship, for navigating, for manning all those ropes, all the way down to cooking and managing all those stores of food that would have to be set into the ship for that length of time. And you would have clear ground rules for everyone. So we've all heard another expression, the captain needs to run a tight ship. And that would be something that would be really important. So as you set sail and say you're sailing along and the weather's fine and everything's going well, but suddenly something occurs, there's a change or a stressor. It might be just something like a shift in the wind. It might be a big storm or a hurricane, or say even an attack by pirates. During that time of transition, how does the captain help the ship get through those rough seas to weather the storm? Well, he might call to batten down the hatches, or he may, make a call, all hands on deck, or he might have to give instructions for trimming the sails, and which would basically be adapting them to fit the altered state that everyone is experiencing. And then eventually the stormy seas would start to settle, and there would be a potential period of recovery. So during that time, they'd assess the position of the ship and any damages or losses that the ship might have experienced. They'd clean and swab the decks, and they'd have to navigate to get that ship back onto the desired course that was initially planned. Hopefully through all of that, at some point, the ship would return back to smooth sailing once again. So for you all, we are going to be presenting ideas in this before, during, and after framework, but we also want you to, again, think back to the stages of development that we talked about earlier. So, just like the ship is going to be going through its voyage, the ship may need to go back through the cycles of forming, storming, norming, and performing, maybe multiple times during its voyage, depending on the weather and the circumstances. So when it comes to the EMDT, what might you do to work on strengthening your team so that you can be prepared in case of a loss or transition? So in other words, you might want to think, how can I, as the captain of this ship or team, ensure that everything stays on course with the team functioning as efficiently and effectively as possible? Being as open as possible to accepting any and all case referrals if you can, so if they fit your criteria. As an EMDT coordinator, being really helpful to referral sources, all your referring sources, so that they will hopefully continue to bring cases after that first one that they might bring. And staying active as a team and, continuing to work on cases and continuing to have things to do, as you probably all know, really can help keep the team interested and working despite a potential change in membership. You want to have team procedures in place that everyone is aware of and communicate those ground rules that you have regularly so everyone on your team knows and feels really safe and comfortable with the routine. If the team's procedures allow, consider welcoming guests to join your team meeting, because you really never know when a guest may, then be exposed to the EMDT and may decide to bring you a new referral. And a guest may also potentially become interested in the EMDT and later become a valuable team member. And then identify any team members that you have who are, proponents of the EMDT, your cheerleaders, and use them whenever you can. So, if you need to have potential introduction, if you need new members, maybe they can give you some potential introductions. They can, rally new members and also even rally the group as a whole. And just having them attending meetings sometimes, just having, those certain people, key people attending regularly, knowing that their consistent presence is at a meeting can really be helpful in setting that positive example for all the rest of your team. And then if your schedule does allow you to do this, if you can accept those invitations to go to community functions and events and speak about the EMDT, join those community coalitions and really get to know the community that you're in, it can be so helpful when, the something arises and you need something from the community or you need to fill a gap. The more folks that the bigger the pool you're going to have to pull from, and that can really help you. And then just some other things to think about when, to really try to get your team as strong as possible. If you notice that someone is not attending meetings on kind of a consistent basis, really try to check in with them to assess why. Could there be something that they need that you could potentially provide for them or help out? And I'm going to give an example here that, I had a team member that stopped coming to meetings, and, it was really noticeable that she wasn't there. And it took several months, to be honest, before I was informed that this person actually had pretty significant hearing loss. So, if I had reached out a little bit earlier, I don't know that I would have found that, but once I knew that, I was able to reach out and see if there were ways that we could make attending the virtual meetings. She had stopped coming when the meetings were virtual because she really couldn't hear very well the nuanced conversations. So that might have been something that could have been helpful to her. And you might also want to find out if there's other ways that your team member can be of assistance to you, even if they can't attend meetings. So, you may find out that they say, their workload is incredibly increased during this period of time, but maybe can they still be available to you if you need to consult them or, you need to pull on their expertise. And I would also suggest, if you can do this, to think about acknowledging any gaps in your team. If there are team members that are consistently not showing up, it's probably being noticed by your team. Your team is probably noticing this. So, acknowledge with them that you recognize this, and that can really help that, your team will have some confidence that you're recognizing this and that you're working on trying to improve that problem. If you're losing membership or attendance is just sagging in general, consider, are there things that you can do to change things up? So, maybe meeting on different days or meeting less frequently or maybe even more frequently, and ask your team what they suggest. So you might decide to offer a confidential survey so they can give you some feedback, or you can offer to use some meeting time to have a discussion about concerns, or even hold another whole team meeting to just discuss team attendance. And this probably goes without saying, but in everything that you do, from the number of calls to the emails and to the length of your meetings, I know you're always trying to respect and recognize team member time commitment, and that can be so helpful. And think about, really celebrate your team members who are showing up and who are being so consistent and helpful, and also celebrate all those EMDT wins. So even the big ones, not just the big ones, but even the small ones. So, I mean, if you hold a team meeting after a hiatus and you have, people show up that haven't been there in a while, celebrate that, or at least, give some positive kudos and really acknowledge that you appreciate people. And consider, celebrating the big wins as well. Obviously, the prosecutions or restitutions, or if it's a team anniversary of some kind. If you keep track of dates and things like that, that might be something to just throw out there as a bonus. Have a plan in case that there is a transition. If you have a backup plan in mind, and Leigh's going to be talking a little bit more about planning. And then again, this probably also goes without saying, but just really focusing on your group as a team can help in building that cohesiveness and morale of everyone on your team.
Thanks, Jill. What I really love about the tall ship analogy is that it emphasizes that every person on the team has a role to play when it comes to planning, when it comes to supporting the team process in moving forward in a team transition. And like Jill said, it's really important to bake celebratory acknowledgements into your team process. So if that means when you're closing cases, you're acknowledging the wins on that particular case. If there's a team anniversary that's coming up that you're tracking, to have success stories to share with your team so that they're aware that you're aware of how incredible their support is and of the clients. Additionally, during the feedback process, that's another opportunity for baking celebratory acknowledgements into the team process. So that's just a note I had on what Jill said, or in addition. So during a transition, one of the most pivotal aspects is managing the here and now. So how we handle the present moment can really set the tone for the coming days and weeks, particularly when it comes to an incoming transition. So firstly, when you're weathering the storm, the first step in navigating a transition effectively is to acknowledge it. Address it as soon as you become aware or shortly after. The transparency there can really help to build trust and ensure that everyone is on the same page. You can strategize with existing members regarding the needs and the gaps on your team. So ask questions like, how will this transition impact the team? Will it create a gap in service or expertise? Who is missing and who needs to be asked to the table? Consider using your team members' community connections for recruitment. And don't be afraid to request an introduction or an invitation to a meeting. So your team is really there to support you and as the coordinator, and vice versa. And so as you're trying to build out your team and identify gaps, your team has a stake in that process as well. And so that's something that really underscores all of the strategies that we're going to be talking about today. Additionally, try to be upfront. It's easy to wish challenges away, but confronting them head on is really quite productive. Whether there's a service gap that you're anticipating, a challenging situation, or a palpable absence of a team member, acknowledging the situation ensures that you can address it together as a team. It's also important to honor the person or the people who are departing, who are leaving your team. It helps the rest of your team feel valued, and recognizing and appreciating the contributions of a departing team member not only pays respect to that person, but reinforces the value that each team member brings. And that really goes back to what Jill mentioned about celebrating successes. It's important to to acknowledge when your team has the success. It's also important to acknowledge that every agency and team member on your team brings something, regardless if they have a, you know, a tangible case success or not. And a straightforward way to do that is to honor the people who are leaving your team. Additionally, and we're going to talk more in depth about this in a bit, if where possible, create an environment for knowledge transfer between the people who are leaving and the team members who are coming on. So having both the outgoing and incoming members in the same room can help to offer clarity and smooth the changeover. And like I said, we're going to be talking about this more in depth later, about what you can expect to discuss during a transition meeting, and how to really make that the most impactful that it can be. Next slide, please. Also, engage your team in the process. Tapping into the collective intelligence and network of your team can really be invaluable. So if you're searching for a replacement, someone on your team might know just the perfect work person for that role. So make sure that, you know, in your team, as you're acknowledging the transitioning team member, like we mentioned before, to pick your team members' brains about who they know who might be a good fit for the team, who they know who might be able to fill a service gap. Additionally, try leveraging new additions to the team. New team members come with fresh perspectives, expertise, and networks. Engage with them to understand who they might want on board or collaborations they might suggest. Who do they want to work with? It's important to optimize the resources that you do have, because small teams really can get a lot done. Small teams can be really mighty, and it's all about using the resources that you have most effectively. As your team member is transitioning, that's not necessarily the point to cut ties with that team member. Where are they going? Is the team member leaving, remaining in the field, or are there other potential ways for collaboration in the future? Could they represent a different agency but still remain a team asset? Are they still part of an agency that might be able to refer cases? Because that person can still be a connection for your team moving forward, even if they aren't in the same role on the team that they have been in the past. Additionally, use referral sources. Extend your search for potential team members through your referral networks. It's a testament to the interconnectedness of our field. We work in a small field, and a lot of people know each other. So if someone has referred a case in the past, they might be interested in joining the team, especially if they have referred a case that has seen results. Tackling a transition head-on with open communication and collective effort really ensures not only continuity but growth of your team, and that's really what we're aiming to achieve here. Next slide, please. So when you're faced with a transition, having a robust plan in place is really key. It's not just about filling a vacant role, but ensuring that the agency remains effectively represented on your team. And that's something that can be achieved through a number of different strategies. So transitions provide an opportunity to strengthen our ties and reinforce agency representation. So let's break down how we can achieve that, specifically in building a transition plan with the outgoing and incoming team members. I mentioned a bit earlier that having a transition plan in place, or having a transition meeting with the outgoing and incoming members of your team is essential. And can really help you to bridge the knowledge gap that might be there between the people who are leaving your team and might be joining on. But what does that look like? What does the meeting itself look like? What sort of knowledge should you be focused on transitioning? First, I want to emphasize that the goal is to keep the agency member represented on your team, and to maintain agency representation. I've worked with coordinators in the past who, with specific transitioning agency members, have said, we proudly feature your agency on our flyer. Let's ensure it stays that way. Who will be your new representative? Make sure that agency decision makers are engaged at all levels. So nurturing relationships, not just with the referral sources, the caseworkers and the supervisors who have direct case knowledge, but also with case managers and even county specific officials like the commissioner or the deputy commissioner of DSS can be really helpful in certain cases. And I know that will vary from place to place, and that a lot of the coordinators on the call right now have work in a variety of different states and systems. So that might be different for your particular region, but it's still important to think about engaging decision makers at all levels and what that looks like for you. Also, re-engage key stakeholders. Sometimes essential stakeholders, for example, the county DA, might lose touch. A re-engagement strategy is really vital. And remember that many of these stakeholders, especially in those managerial positions, might have been aware of the EMDT at one point or at the inception, but have lost track of what's going on over time. So use success stories to reel those people back in, highlight a specific case that showcases the importance of a specific discipline. Emphasize why their representation is invaluable and how their unique contributions have led to tangible success, both for you as the coordinator, and for the team, but also for them and their agency. And in this case, it's important to also foster a warm handoff where possible, which can really also be very invaluable to facilitate meetings between the outgoing and incoming members, which ensures that institutional knowledge is passed on and creates a smoother transition for everyone involved. Next slide, please.
So once you've experienced a transition, how can you work to get your team back on track? Well, a first step is going to be to gauge how the team is doing. So like we talked about earlier, really try to think about what effects have you seen on the team. And you may start to think, this might be the time for making some big changes, or maybe it's not. You will have to decide. If a team hasn't met in a while, so if the transition caused, a gap in time between meetings, really consider, going ahead and holding a meeting again as soon as possible. You've all heard that adage, build it and they will come. And I think we're all here and we all know that that is not always so simple. But it really is true that if the longer you go between meetings and the longer that the team is apart, the harder it's going to be to bring them back together and get them to be functioning again. And if you think back to if you have to go through those cycles of storming and norming back to get to your performing, that's going to take some time, and it's not going to happen if you're not holding meetings. You might consider reviewing or reminding the folks about your team policies and procedures, especially if you have new people that have come on board. You might also want to think about having considering like a redo or maybe revisiting some policies and procedures, maybe previously rejected ideas that now may be the time to reconsider them. If you have had previous in-services for your team or presentations in the past, but it's been a really long time, or you have enough new members of the group, consider having repeating them and having potentially the forensic accountant come in and do a review again, or having APS discuss once again what they can and can't do, any new learning opportunities, but as well revisiting some of the old ones. You may find that could be helpful, and folks sometimes really do appreciate learning things again. And of course, another one of those, probably don't need to say this, but be as welcoming as possible to your new team members, being as helpful as possible to them. I sound like a broken record when I say that, but coordinators, if you can be helpful to folks, it's going to ensure that you are offering that good initial experience for them, and hopefully it'll keep your new team member coming back.
So up until now, we've been talking really in depth about team member transitions, but something we haven't touched on quite as much is a coordinator absence. So I'm going to pose this question to the group: how might a team member absence differ from a coordinator absence? And while you're adding your responses in the chat, I'm going to power on through. So we know that the coordinator is responsible for keeping meetings on the calendar, getting the referrals, managing team dynamics, and so much more behind the scenes work. And so the absence of a coordinator, whether that be a temporary or permanent transition, whether that be a short or long-term transition, can really have an impact on the dynamics at play and at the team level. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes or a minute to write answers in the chat if you would like.
So a couple of our grantees are dealing with the ending of their grant and unsure where the next amount of funding is coming from. So I'm certainly hoping y'all are thinking about that moving forward and how you might address that with your team.
I see in the chat, very often the coordinator is the glue. Team members may feel a little lost with a coordinator's departure. Absolutely. Thank you, Marty. A coordinator absence would confuse the MDT members. Absolutely. Thanks, Jamie. So it says that it looks like a hole in the ship without a coordinator. Absolutely. I love that. Thanks for calling it back to the tall ship analogy. The program coordinator is crucial. A team member absence could be absorbed by another team member, but it is still a loss. Yep. And that differs pretty significantly from the coordinator, because, like you said, they're the captain of the ship, and if there's a hole in the, I wish I had as many like ship related phrases as Jill does, but yeah, to keep something in ship shape, you need the captain. So the coordinator leaving can jeopardize the meeting schedule, the flow of communication, the buy-in of the agencies on the team, the general sense of clarity around what the goals are for the team, and team morale. And that's a really big weight to carry for a lot of coordinators. I work with a coordinator who went out on maternity leave during the development phase of her team. And so we were all, of course, really excited for her, and also trying to figure out, how do we continue to build and develop relationships with key stakeholders when there is no coordinator at the helm of the team. And something that we did was to institute a clear plan for the months that she was gone about the meetings continuing, identifying someone to facilitate the teams in her absence, who was going to take the referrals, et cetera, to basically fill in for that coordinator. But on top of that, we had to identify what key information the coordinator had that was important for her, the person who was filling in for her to have as well. Jill, did you have anything to add here, or any examples you wanted to speak on before we move on to the full strategy?
Yeah, no, I'll let you move on.
Then next slide, please. So when it comes to coordinator transitions, it's really essential to have a plan. If you know in advance, you have to be sure to communicate that with your team and include who they can contact if questions or a new referral arises, and how they can contact that person. Jill mentioned earlier, if you build it, they will come. I have another one: use it or lose it. As much as possible, try to keep the team meetings happening and keep an avenue open for referrals. Additionally, is there anyone who can keep the team meetings happening while the coordinator is temporarily unavailable? I spoke about the coordinator who went on maternity leave. It's important to choose a surrogate in the case where a coordinator is out for a period of time that you can plan for. Perhaps someone on the team who's familiar with the dynamics at the team, who's familiar with the personality of the team, or another person at the coordinator's agency who's able to keep the team meetings happening. But overall, it's really essential to keep those ties. So if possible, have the designated surrogate send an email or two during the absence as a reminder that the EMDT is still up and running, even if meetings aren't happening as often as they did when the original coordinator was on board. And also, it's important to generally be humble. As a new or interim coordinator coming to an established team, don't assume. The team likely has a set way of doing things, so ask if you need to get up to speed on the team. However, a surrogate, interim, or new coordinator will have more sway if they're armed with knowledge about the team and the cases. So if you're passing a team on to a surrogate for a period of time, or if you're the surrogate themselves, to read up and review those cases, try to know where the process stands with each, and as much as possible, know the procedures of the team. But the team might not look the same as it did when the original coordinator was on board. So where possible, streamline processes and use your team to define what those streamlined processes should look like. I also have worked with a team that lost a significant amount of funding, and so a team of 5 coordinators who was coordinating a team of 3 coordinators who was coordinating 5 separate teams turned to one person coordinating 5 teams. And that one person isn't going to be able to fully do all of the work of 3 people, and they shouldn't be expected to. So a strategy that we employed was to approach each team with, what's working, what isn't working, and what can we really, like, of the processes that are happening, what can we really slash, and how do we streamline what's going on so that one person can be able to take on all of this workload, essentially. So what that looked like for her was the coordinator was no longer having separate case reviews with each agency on a weekly basis. When there was a robust team coordinating 5 counties, each coordinator every week had a meeting with an agency to have kind of like open what do you call it? Like an open time for agencies to come and bring cases and their case questions. When there was one person taking on that workload, that piece of the puzzle was kind of slashed, and we were able to have the team members approach the coordinator directly with the referrals they had, as opposed to having a set time every week where any agency could just drop in and have essentially office hours for the coordinator. So use your team to define what they need and streamline processes where possible, whether it's a planned, temporary, unplanned, long-term absence or not. Yeah. Next slide, please.
Okay, so as you can see, as you're probably reading through our takeaways, some of these are really pretty basic. So, recognize change is hard on everyone. Change can be really hard, especially on you as the coordinator trying to, fill all of these roles and do all of this work. And I'll give, just a brief example of another transition that happened to one of our upstate New York teams, where she went out on medical leave for a period of time and thought that she had a plan in place, and unfortunately, some of the plans and some of the pre-work that she did kind of fell through. And when she got back from her medical leave, she really discovered that there were times when she would be holding meetings and she might be the only person at the meeting. And that, as a coordinator, is going to be really hard and really difficult. So, acknowledge that it's a process, thinking back to the cycle of development. You're going to have to go through those difficult times, the forming and the storming. Those can be really difficult for you and for your team. But team in general, we just want to say that I think that you would all agree that people really do want the team to succeed. And, you really do have people in your corner. I would believe that Leigh would probably agree that we've seen a lot of transitions, and especially this past year. And of all of those, I've been to lots of team meetings where, I've seen that, it was potentially a new coordinator coming in after an interim coordinator who was the interim coordinator for a couple of months because the other agency lost their funding or decided not to participate in the program. And so it was probably really difficult for the team, but they were very welcoming and just very much appreciated people coming in and again being helpful to them. So I think if you think of it, everybody, we're all in the same boat. Again, another ship analogy. But your good communication and your flexibility and sometimes potentially thinking outside of the box, hopefully you can steer your team to into turning the corner after any transition that you would experience. And my final ship analogy for you is to tell you that turning the corner is actually, that does come from a nautical turn of phrase. So there are many phrases that we have in our English language that come way back from naval language or nautical language. So turning the corner actually meant when was used by sailors. So when they would sail, go on a very long, possibly around the world voyage, when they passed the Cape of Good Hope, which is at the very southern tip of Africa, that would mean that it was a time that that they were passing that critical point on the way to somewhere better and safer. So hopefully you can think of that as you go forth. And finally, before we take a couple questions, I do want to put in a plug for your wonderful Betsy and Lisa. So you're not alone on your journeys, and your TA providers are always available and ready to assist you in any way that they can. And does anybody have any questions? It looks like we've got a couple minutes left. I don't know if you want to throw questions in the chat or even just unmute yourself and
you can unmute and ask what you need to.
Yeah. While we're waiting, if anybody has a question, I will tell you that the ship analogy came because there's a series of books. If you've ever heard of, there's a movie called Master and Commander starring Russell Crowe many years ago. Some of you may not be old enough to know that movie, but there is actually a book series by Patrick O'Brien. It's like 20-something books that are, it's basically a ship, a captain who kind of goes through his journey and his friend who is his doctor on board. And it's just a really great series. If you're ever interested, I would highly recommend them.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Have the other teams experienced in the summertime sort of a little bit of a drop in absence, especially of some, key members that I like to think, I like to have on the team. I feel like it brings in, gets excitement for new members to join. And then I've noticed that in the last 2, so July and August, meetings they haven't appeared in there among others. And so some of my colleagues at work had mentioned maybe it's due to the summer because we have seasons here in Chicago. And I just wondered if that's usual, if that's something you guys have seen. I've only been in MDT for a little less than 3 months, coordinator, so relatively new.
Yeah, so I would say absolutely summertime, especially, you know, around holidays, sometimes that can happen. And as a coordinator, my suggestion would be, you know, it's going to be up to you to kind of gauge your team on whether you should hold meetings during those times. So, you know, it's being an EMDT coordinator is always a balancing act, right? It's really that balancing act between, you know, you want to make good use of people's time, but like we talked about in this presentation, you don't want to go too long without holding a meeting. So a strategy that you might consider using is poll your team, you know, send out a brief email saying, you know, if this, I recognize this is near this vacation time, you know, potentially should we hold a meeting this time? Are people going to be around? That could help.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I think it's easier to disappear from certain responsibilities when you feel anonymous in them. And so reach out to, if there's a specific team member in mind who consistently isn't showing up, reach out to them, see if you can plan some kind of a meeting to check in, see, you know, what are you getting from the team? How can we enhance the team experience for you? And I think in addition to getting that kind of information and being valuable information for you to have, it also will have kind of a double whammy effect of also making them feel like they are seen and they are watched if you are aware that they are not present.
Thank you.
Jamie, you can also, when, you know, after a meeting that they miss, you can pick up the phone and call them and say, I missed you at this past meeting. I know you're swamped right now, blah, 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 blah. But just wanted to let you know that when you're not there, you know, I miss your insights or what you bring to the table. And if you don't mind, just let me know if you're going to be, you know, out of the office or out of the whatever, just so I can prepare differently without you there.
Good point, Lisa. Thank you. And I want to thank Leigh and Jill. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I will be sending out this PowerPoint, so you'll have their contact information. And I've placed in the chat a link to the evaluation. I'll also email that out, but we really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much for joining us today.